Men will automatically process their emotions in an active kind of way in order to deal with their grief. Men are pushed biologically to strive for status, to try and appear as high in the hierarchy as they possibly can be. The hierarchy then limits a man's interest in emoting in public. Ladies, out there, admire your husband. Don't bullshit it. You know, he'll pick it up in a second. But the things you really do admire in him, tell him. Tell him that you admire that. That's going to open him up like a can. He just opens right up.
Tom, welcome to The Meaning of Men. What do you want people to get out of today's conversation?
Well, I guess if you could sum it up in a small space, it would be that I want men to understand that they're different and that they have different ways to do things, especially in the way they deal with emotions. And we'll be talking about it, but that's kind of the basics, is that I want men to understand their own uniqueness, their own beauty, the beauty in the way they do things.
Give me a sense of your background. How did you come to do what you're doing today?
Well, I went to graduate school and got out and thought, oh, I want to help people, and I couldn't get a job and couldn't get a job and couldn't get a job for about a year. It took me a year to find a job. And finally, this Center for Death and Dying says, oh, we'll take you. I said, great, sign me up. So here I go into the Center for Death and Dying. I didn't know that much about death and dying. I knew a little bit. But so I go in and I start working, and almost all of my clients are men. And it took me a while to figure out what was going on. There was 17 female therapists there and one male, me. And so the women were giving me all of the men because they didn't like working with men. They thought, oh, these men don't deal with their feelings. These men don't grieve. So I got them all. And so I struggled because, I'd been taught in graduate school a certain way to deal with people in therapy. And almost all of it was for women, basically. It was all based on what women want, what women need in order to process their emotions. And so when I worked with women, it was great. It's like, oh man, this is easy. I'm really doing something good. When I was working with men, it was very different. When I'd want to make good eye contact, right? Good eye contact. And for women, that works great. For men, what does that mean? What does eye contact mean? It means something very different. It took me a while, but I figured out eye contact for men means challenge, means competition. Now, when men have eye contact with women, that's different. That's a different thing altogether. But with another man, it means challenge. So here I was challenging these guys instead of helping them find some sort of place where they could process what was happening. So, and over the years then, it took me a long time to see the differences between men and women. And one of the first things I ran into was this research on cross-cultural grief. Man, it was fascinating. And I remember reading it and getting so excited because what the research said was indigenous cultures, when they have funerals, right, they have a very separate space for women to emote and to interchange, to interact, etc. But they give men tasks. They give men things to do. And the more I read, the more excited I got because it was obvious, that, wait a minute, what's going on here? Why is it that they give the women a place to emote and the men something to do? And then I realized after a long time why that was. But the important thing is that the men have very different ways to process things. Gosh, there was one group of indigenous people where the men were to sing the life of the person who died at the funeral. So the men had to divvy up the life. Okay, you sing the first years, you sing this, you sing that. And it was men working together, shoulder to shoulder, to try and produce something that would honor the person who died. Of course, the men built the casket, the men dug the grave, the men did the eulogy, the men did all of these things, right? And then I started realizing, our culture in the United States has completely gotten rid of all the things to do. Someone else digs the grave. Someone else takes care of the body. Someone else does the ritual. So it leaves men tapping their feet in funeral homes, feeling awkward. What am I supposed to do, you know? And so, that was just a real realization for me, was that men are very different, and we have different ways to do things. When I first started watching men, I started getting excited because the more I watched, the more I saw that these men were already doing actions. They were doing things that were processing the emotions. Oh my gosh. And from then on, after about 5 or 10 years of figuring things out, I started realizing what was going on. So the men, when they'd come to me, they'd say, "Oh, my wife says I'm not grieving, and that's why I came to you." And we'd spend a session or two teaching him how he literally was grieving, but he didn't know it. Men do this crap automatically. They do it automatically. They do it without thinking, just like women automatically talk about stuff. Men will automatically process their emotions in an active kind of way in order to deal with their grief. It's a very, very different kind of thing.
It's interesting because as you were talking there, I was thinking, I don't think I've ever considered that there are different ways of grieving, and then there are differences to how men and women grieve. It was interesting. Also, when you mentioned about eye contact, I automatically looked away because I realised I was kind of looking at you, and then
And why? Why would you
it,
automatically look away?
well, you said it was intimidating.
Yes, and men will do this automatically. They will look away. In fact, gosh, when you're in a subway, right? You're on the subway car, you're da, 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 and your gaze catches another man's eye. What happens? You have a clock inside that starts ticking that says, how long should I wait before I avert my gaze? Usually it's very quickly, because the mind knows, men know intuitively that if they hold a gaze with another man who they don't know, they hold a gaze with him too long, that means challenge, that means conflict. So we do this automatically. We do it without thinking. No one's thinking about it. Men aren't thinking about this. They're just freaking doing it, you know?
What does this subject mean so much to you? And the book that you wrote, The Way Men Heal, which is a fascinating insight and really does challenge a lot of the norms and the stereotypes around how men grieve, as you were alluding to there. Why does this subject mean so much to you?
Mm. It means a lot to me because, I didn't have much investment in it when I first started out working with things. But the more I did it, the more I realized that men are getting crushed. They're getting crushed for not being right, you know? And that started pissing me off. It started engaging me into wanting to change things, engaging me into, I kept waiting for someone to write the book. I'd go to the bookstore and go, okay, has someone written a book on men and grief yet? Has someone written a book? No one had written it. So after about, 5 years of waiting for someone else to write it, I said, screw it, I'm going to do it myself. And so I did it because it's important to me that men feel good about themselves as they naturally are. And to see a whole group of people denigrating themselves because they're not like another group, when actually they're very different and very unique in their ways to do things, is very hurtful. And so I dedicated a lot of my energy into trying to help that move through so that men start to understand how they're different. And women start understanding it too. And I'm telling you, when women start understanding it, it's great because they've never been taught this. I do workshops for mental health professionals on this stuff. And usually after the workshop, I'll have one or two women come up to me and go, "Oh, Mr. Colden, thank you so much. Now I understand my husband, my brothers, my son." And one woman came up to me in tears, just crying. She says, "Oh, thank you so much." I go, "What's going on? What's with the tears?" She said, "Now I understand what happened with my family after my mother died." I said, "Well, tell me what happened." She said, "Well, what happened was, after she died, my father and my brothers tore the house apart and redid room after room after room." She said, "Now I know they were doing that in honor of my mother, because that's the way my mother always wanted the house to be." Oh, And that's what men do. They'll do things like that in honor of the loss. Men will take actions that honor the loss in one way or another. And it's through that action that they start then telling the story of their loss. Like when my father died, my brother and I built the box to hold his ashes, right? And that week when we built it, we'd invite his friends over, and his older friends would come and they'd help us build it. And we're working together, and you know how men are when they get together building a project like that, right? I mean, can't you bevel that edge better? You know, how about that? Don't do it like that, right? But also, during the time we're working shoulder to shoulder on this box, we're telling stories about my dad. And my brother and I were telling the old stories about, what he was like when he was younger. And they were telling the stories about what it was like with them. And there was plenty of teardrops on that floor, on the garage floor that was soaked up by the sawdust, you know? But it was men being able to connect with each other in an emotional way by doing a project together, right? And telling the story within that project. They feel safety shoulder to shoulder doing something together. This is where men get close. Men on the police force, shoulder to shoulder, doing something together. Men in the army, same thing. The more dangerous the task, the closer men tend to get. So, this is where we all find safety in order to process our emotions, right? It's just that men and women find very different ways to find safety.
One thing I want to explore later with you is how, as a mother, a wife, a partner, a friend, you can recognize this behavior in men and help them grieve in the way that's more natural to them. Because I think that's very important. A lot of people listening will want some advice on that. Um,
Yes,
Before we get into that, though, I think that the burning question in my mind, certainly, and probably people listening, is like, why? Why is it that men generally talk less about their emotions? And I recognize it in my own friendship groups as well. It's certainly something that resonates, but like, why is there something biological going on here? Like,
yes,
what's the underlying
yes.
theme going on?
There's something biological going on here. And the latest research, the last 10 years of research on testosterone has opened things up in a new sort of way. We know now that testosterone is not about violence and aggression. It is to a degree, but a small degree. Primarily what it's about is striving for status. Men are pushed biologically to strive for status, to try and appear as high in the hierarchy as they possibly can be. Does that make sense?
Hmm.
Men live in a hierarchy. We live in a hierarchy all the time of who's first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, and who's on top. Who is it on top, right? That's just the nature of men. And the reason is A, testosterone pushes us to want to be better, to want to strive for status. And B, there's this thing called precarious manhood, which is the social side of things that pushes men to strive for status from a social perspective, where women are expecting men to be a certain way. And women will judge men for not doing this or that, and they love men if they do X, Y, Z, right? So this is also, it's shaping the way men are, is what women want. Because what's the purpose of the hierarchy? The purpose of the hierarchy is to get the girl. The higher you are up in the hierarchy, the more likely you're going to get the most attractive female, right? And so testosterone pushes us to want to get up that hierarchy and wants to uh, make the women think that we're good guys, right? So men will shape their behavior in order to do that. And so we've got this double push. One side is testosterone, is pushing us from the inside that says strive for status, win, 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 win. And we've got this other thing, precarious manhood, which pushes us from the outside that says push, 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 get higher, 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 higher. And so men literally are pushed to try and do this.
So the counter to that then would being vulnerable and open about your emotions be a sign of weakness and therefore push you down the pecking order?
Exactly. Exactly. And that's why men don't want to open up about emotions. Because if you up about emotions in public, what happens? Your stock goes down. But this is the hierarchy. And the hierarchy then limits a man's interest in emoting in public. And it also has created a very clever way for him to be able to process emotions without emoting publicly. He tells his story through doing, not through talking.
And I assume this is, I mean, this will be going back to hunter-gatherer days, right? And I
Yeah.
suppose in the last 1,000 years or so, society has just moved on so much, and a lot of those kind of like very deep ingrained ways of being are obviously still there, and
Yes.
we haven't
Yes.
caught up to modern society because
Yes.
we're living in an age now where men are expected to talk more about their emotions and are expected to be open. And if they're not, as you were saying there, women are confused in terms of, well, how are they processing their grief? And so there seems to be this kind of like almost internal battle between these really deep rooted, from our past of being hunter gatherers, as I said, to modern day society, which looks completely different now, and yet our brains are still wired in the same ways as they were all those years ago.
Yes. And that's the way it is.
Before we dive back into the episode, if you're enjoying these conversations, please do hit that subscribe button and leave a review. These two actions really make a huge difference and help the show reach more people who can benefit from these discussions. Let's keep building this community together. Thanks for being part of it. Back to the episode. And I suppose how fatherhood has come on again plays into that, because there's another emotional strand that men are needing, expecting to be, and yet, again, going back to how they have been historically, there's going to be challenges there with like how they're going to be with their children as well, how they show emotion, how they show grief, and how their children understand that as well.
Men do really well when they just let themselves do what feels natural to them. And they're finding out now all kinds of things. Did you know that when a woman becomes pregnant, she doesn't even know she's pregnant yet, the man's hormones start to change. His testosterone goes down. It goes down. And
Really?
they've also found that when women or men and women have a little kid, a little teeny kid, 1, 2 years old, and they both get a burst of oxytocin, the same hormone. But for the woman, it encourages her to talk babyese. Oh, baby, coo, 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 right? For the man, it encourages him to throw the kid up in the air. Same hormone, but the brain is interpreting it very, very differently. So we have different responses. And, the women, when you throw the kid up in the air, the women go, don't do that. Oh my God. Right? They get scared. But the men know that it's only that far up. They're just having a good time. And they also have found that when men do this, when men throw the kids up in the air, that child who's had an experience of being thrown up in the air like that does better with risk-taking later in life. Isn't that interesting? There's all kinds of things that men do naturally. Roughhousing. Men will naturally roughhouse with their children. Guess what they've found about roughhousing? Roughhousing with children increases the child's capacity for empathy. It's just, you can't make this stuff up. I mean, men need to be able to say, you know what, this is what I feel to do. I mean, this is what my intuition says this is what I should do. Do that. Do it. Unless it's hurtful. You'll know if it's hurtful or not. And the same thing with emotions. Men don't have to think about what to do with their emotions. They just do it. They just do it automatically. Can you love yourself for being man? And that's the real question.
And accepting those differences, I think
Yeah,
the underlying theme here is that there are fundamental differences, and that should be celebrated. And actually, from the point
exactly.
of view of parenting, for example, there are significant benefits from what you were saying in terms of having those
Oh,
differences.
geez. Yeah, the research now is saying that women, mothers, are really good at raising children. Fathers are really good at raising adults. So it's the shift when the mother is really good with the little ones, but the father takes over in some ways in order to set limits and set boundaries. It's that boundary setting too that they found is involved in empathy. The father sets boundaries. The kids know that they can't push dad. They can push mom. Oh, come on, mom. Can't we? Oh, please. Oh, please. Oh, please. I'll do this. Okay. Dad ain't like that. Dad says, nope. When he says, nope, eat your broccoli, you better eat the broccoli, you know? And this is, what does it do? It teaches the children to learn to see the world through someone else's eyes. When the father, they have to see the world through dad's eyes. And this is the beginning, the rudiments of empathy, rudiments of compassion, is being able to do that. Isn't that fascinating? There's all kinds of things that men do naturally as fathers that are shamed and thrown out as if they're not worth anything. That they're finding, the researchers going, holy crap, this is something that's good. This is a good thing.
What about the dynamics of a relationship between a man and a woman, and how these differences could maybe cause some friction, but also, if they're better understood, how they could make the relationship stronger potentially?
Oh yeah, they certainly cause problems. I have experienced over and over again mothers wanting their boys to be in therapy because they're not crying, right? This one lady came in, and I'll never forget it. She came in, she said, my son, my husband died 6 months ago. My son has yet to shed a tear. He was like 10, right? She said, can you see him in therapy? I said, no, but I'll see you. So she came in and we talked, and I said, what did your son like to do with your husband? She said, he'd like to play basketball. I said, good. This week I want you to play basketball with him. She came back the next week, a changed woman, completely changed. Because what had happened is she went out to play basketball with the son. The son hadn't even talked about his father to her, right? Hadn't even talked about him. But the son and she play basketball. The first thing he says is, Mom, you suck. You can't play like Dad. Because that's what guys do, right? But then they're playing for a while, and he shoots the basket and he says, that's what's called or what Dad called a three-pointer, but I could never make it when he was alive. But 3 weeks ago, I made it for the first time. When I did, I just burst into tears. And the mother then knew, holy crap, I need to play more basketball, because the son was working through his feelings for his father through playing basketball. He was thinking about his dad. Dad would like this. Dad would love that. If only I could do this, then that would impress Dad. He was doing it in honor of his father, right? This is so critical. And women will use this active mode too sometimes. It's not just men. Women will also use the active mode, but their primary is usually the interactive mode. Men, the primary is the active mode. Their interest in talking about it is considerably less. But we're so different, so wonderfully different. And that I get that all the time. Mothers coming in saying, what's wrong with my son? He's not crying. Well, he's crying because when he hits, actually, some guys earlier, but when he hits about 12 years old, the tears dry up. They go away, and they don't come back until later, because it goes, the tears dry up, and about 35, 30, testosterone starts going down. As it goes down, the tears slowly start coming back. So when you get to be my age, it's like, oh, you have tears again. How about that? No shit. They pop up again. So it's biological, man. A lot of it's biological.
It's amazing, actually. I'd never really considered how much our biology will dictate all of this stuff, which is kind of scary in a way, because it feels like it's a lot of stuff that's out of our control. But equally, I feel like if you embrace that and just accept that as reality, and have some kind of understanding, it will just help you deal with things and just like accept, well, that's just the way it is, and you just kind of have to roll with it a little bit.
Yes, yes. And it's okay to accept it and love yourself for who you are. It's also okay to practice other things and practice being able to talk about it. I mean, that's fine, and it's important. In fact, what they've found is when men can come together and they know they're going to be heard, they know they're going to be listened to, they will talk about stuff. But they assume, God, I'll never forget this guy I saw in therapy early on. I said, well, tell me about, what's happening emotionally. And he looked at me and said, do you really want to hear that crap? He was incredulous that anyone would want to hear that. But and that taught me a lesson. Men generally don't think other people want to hear about it. Why don't they think other people want to hear about it? Because they don't. Other people don't want to hear men's feelings. The whole empathy gap thing. And they've found now with the moral typecasting research that women, by and large, will get more compassion than men, period. When I was doing work at this center, and the guys I'd work with, couples sometimes who'd lost a child or whatever, all kinds of grieving stuff, it was obvious to me the woman would get all of the attention. The neighbors, the family, the whoever's, the outside, folks, the workplace would all go to the woman and say, "Oh, how are you today? What can I do for you? How are you feeling? Tell me about your emotions." And they go to the man and they'd say, "How's your wife holding up?" They didn't want to hear his emotions. Men know this. They know this intuitively. They're not going to go running out and emoting. Not only does it drag them down in the hierarchy, but they realize that nobody wants to hear it.
Yeah, that makes me think of a conversation actually I've had recently, and we're going to be covering it in the show around postnatal depression in men and the fact that it's
Huh.
just not recognized, and men are really struggling with it, and
Yes.
it's just not recognized. They don't get the support that they need. Again, is this going back to biology? Is this going back to what you were saying around testosterone and status, or is there something else that's at play here? What are the barriers here for men in terms of like them being able to talk and seek help, do you think?
Well, primarily it's the hierarchy. I mean, if if it was a high status event for you to talk about your emotions, men would be talking about their emotions. Men are pushed into situations where there's status because we're pushed from the outside and the inside to go for status. So, and you're finding today actually in groups of men where it's high status to be able to emote or to be more feminine, the guys are more feminine. Just look at what you see. I mean, it's pretty obvious, you know, because men will strive for status. They'll strive for trying to be what other people think is going to push him up in the hierarchy.
How do cultural differences impact the way that men heal? And what lessons can we learn from other cultures about supporting men's mental health in general?
Hmm. You know, there's so many different ways to do it. I mean, that's one of the things you learn from studying other cultures is there's so many ways to deal with emotions. And the other cultures teach that, and the best ones are the indigenous ones. They're just the professionals when it comes to dealing with emotions. They know more than anybody, and we're kind of the primitives in that way. So studying what other people do, I think, can help, and just to see how our own senses is different. Um, but I think that women need to study the culture of men a little bit, to see how they're different. And by studying men, it's easier to love men if they know what's driving men, what is it about men, you know?
I want to make sure that people listening to this come away with some really practical advice around how they can deal with trauma, and if there's someone in their life, a man in their life that they want to support, that they have the tools to do that as well. So I've got a few final questions for you, Tom. For men that are struggling to express their emotions in a conventional way, what are some of the practical tools or activities they could use to facilitate healing? You were talking, I love the expression shoulder to shoulder. And actually, that's something I've heard in other circles as well. And this idea, as you were saying before, of doing and having an activity and having that as your way of processing. Can you give some more examples, maybe, of what men can do there as well?
Oh, geez, better to give examples of what women can do because it's the women oftentimes who are most concerned about the men not dealing with his emotions. And one of the things she can do is do something active with him or do something that honors the person who died. If his father died, 6 months ago, what could she do? She could say, honey, I'd like to take you out to dinner in honor of your father. Can we do that? And go out to dinner in honor of the father. Or he always loved baseball. Let's go to a baseball game in his honor. shoulder to shoulder. When you get to the game, don't expect him to start talking about his father. Don't expect him to yak, 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 yak. Enjoy the game. Enjoy the game together. And his father will probably come up in some ways, and just let that flow as it does. But don't try and control it. Don't try and make him talk about things. Just enjoy the game. And if he knows that you want to honor his father, that opens him up like a book. He's going to really appreciate that. I mean, that's just, to men, that says, oh, she understands that I'm processing things. She understands me in a different kind of way. So for women to be able to do that, to do an activity with the man, like the mother who played basketball with the son. I mean, do things shoulder to shoulder. You know, maybe it's play basketball, maybe it's go run. Who knows what it is? But that brings men out. That will open him up, you know?
Why is that, out of interest? Is that, again, kind of going back to the biology, does that give men permission that if they open up in that scenario, it's not going to affect their status in any way?
Yes. Yes, she's given him permission. You know, God, for years, women would ask me in therapy, how can I get my husband to do this and that and the other? And I say, well, it's simple. Admire him. If you admire him, he will open up. Because think about it. When you say to a guy, hey, you did a really nice job on that, what's the first thing he's going to say to you? Well, I could have done this and that. But yeah, it's pretty good, right? He's going to tell you how he's lacking once he knows you're admiring him. So that's kind of what we were talking about before. If she tells him that she sees how he is moving through action and that's a part of his grief, then that's like admiring him in a way. So ladies out there, admire your husband. Don't bullshit him. He'll pick it up in a second. But the things you really do admire in him, tell him. Tell him that you admire that. That's going to open him up like a can. He just opens right up. Once men know they're admired, because it relieves them from having to prove they're a certain way in the hierarchy. You know, she's saying in my book, you're at this level or above, and that makes it easier for him then to open up.
And that goes back to another conversation actually I was having recently with another guy that was specializing in trauma, and he was saying that men increasingly nowadays do not feel like they're enough. And what you were saying there, I think, really ties into that nicely, because men sometimes just need that validation to feel better about themselves, but also give them that space to be able to open up and talk as well.
And how could men feel they're enough when they're living in a world that calls them toxic? Can't do it. Men are disdained in today's world. Men are looked at, just as if they're the problem. They're the oppressors. Oh, God. How are you going to feel good about yourself in that kind of environment? You're not. You're not. That's important for men to know, that they're living in a culture that disdains them, that does not like them, that does not honor them, that does not admire them. You know? And how can men feel good about themselves in a culture like that?
What's one important thing, Tom, that we haven't discussed today and we really should have done?
Well, we didn't tell any stories about the way men do grieve. You know, the because stories really help us understand what's going on. Let me tell you a quick story. Let's talk about Michael Jordan. His father was murdered in 1992, I think, and Jordan was close to his father. And about a month after his father was murdered, Jordan held a press conference. And the press conference said, I'm leaving basketball. I'm leaving basketball. I'm going to go play minor league baseball. People were like, what the hell's going on with Jordan, right? Didn't make any sense. Made no sense at all. And a lot of people still don't think it makes any sense. But what we've found out since then is that Jordan's father always wanted him to play baseball. He had told him since he was a little boy that he'd be the best baseball player ever, right? So Jordan stopped his fabled career in order to honor his father by doing what his father always wanted him to do. Oh, isn't that beautiful? I mean, that's mature masculinity right there. That is mature masculinity, because in his autobiography, he talks about when he went to the practice baseball, he'd talk to his father going in. He'd say things about, well, I'm here. And when he's up at bat, right, he'd be talking to his father. He's saying, okay, we're going to hit this one. So he was with his father. He was telling the story of his father. He was telling the story of his love for his father, right? Through this action. No one knew that. No one knew it. They all thought he was nuts for playing baseball. He was grieving. And that's what happens with men.
Tom, it's been absolutely fascinating talking to you today. Thank you for shedding a light on this, because I think it's so important. And I think a lot of people listening will have learnt a lot, I think, from the discussion today, and hopefully we'll be able to take some stuff moving forward. And whether it's a man listening and needing to understand how to process their grief, or I love the fact that we've covered a lot around how the support network can also help with men dealing with this too. And it's been really fascinating, particularly on the biological side, and how hormones play a part in this as well. It's really opened up my eyes, certainly in terms of how all this works, and just getting me to think about different ways of processing grief. So it's been a real pleasure, Tom. Thank you so much for your time today.
It's been my pleasure too, Simeon. Thank you.